This is Leader Time by FedNet, your podcast source for floor remarks by Senate Majority Leader John Thune and Democratic Leader Chuck Schumer. On July 15th, Thune focused his remarks on wasteful government spending as a rescissions package was soon pending. The following material is protected by copyright.
Mr. President, since day one, the Trump administration has been focused on identifying waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government, something on which I believe the American people agree with him on. And last month, the administration submitted a rescissions package to Congress that would cut somewhere around $9 billion in wasteful spending with a focus on woke and wasteful foreign aid dollars. And we're going to consider that common sense legislation this week. I'd love to report that I expect strong support from senators from both parties. But incredibly, Democrats are melting down at the prospect of even the most minor cuts to federal spending. You'd think we were proposing to defund the entire government from the way they're talking, instead of proposing cuts amounting to approximately 0.1% of the federal budget. That's right, Mr. President, 0.1% of the federal budget. This bill that is inspiring such hysteria in Democrats would cut just 0.1%, or 1/1000th of the federal budget. Now, back in the day, Democrat President Bill Clinton signed into law a rescissions package that was 10 times larger as a percentage of total government spending. Yet today's Democrats can't bring themselves to even contemplate cutting just 1/1000th of the federal budget. And let's remember what kind of cuts that we're talking about here. We're not talking about making difficult decisions about essential federal programs or gutting foreign aid. We're talking about modest cuts to funding that has been used for things like promoting vegan food in Zambia, funding a pride parade in Lesotho, teaching children how to make environmentally friendly, quote, reproductive health, unquote, decisions, making aid more considerate of, and I quote, sexual orientation and gender identity, end quote, funding a One Health workforce curriculum which includes material on, quote, environmental racism, end quote, and the importance of DEI. And, Mr. President, the list goes on and on. Thankfully, the Trump administration has stopped these ridiculous wastes of taxpayer money. Now it's time for those of us in Congress to do our part and make sure that the budget reflects these common sense moves, something that every member of this body should be able to agree on. Mr. President, the United States is facing serious budget issues. We saw an incredible growth in spending under the Biden administration, which took what should have been a temporary elevation in spending under COVID and essentially made that the government's new baseline, permanent spending. In 2024, federal spending was a staggering 54% higher than 2019. My Democrat colleagues may not want to acknowledge it, but we have a serious spending problem in this country, Mr. President. And the very least we can do in response is to target some of the egregious misuses of taxpayer dollars that we are addressing today in this bill. Now, Mr. President, in his recent Dear Colleague letter, the Democrat leader claimed, in defiance of abundant evidence to the contrary, that Democrats, quote, support ridding our federal government of waste, fraud, and abuse, end quote. Well, Mr. President, here is a chance for the Democrat leader and his caucus to put their money where their mouth is. If they really support eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse, they can join Republicans and pass this legislation.
For his part, Schumer discussed inflation, the rescissions package, FEMA, Grok, and the nomination of Mike Waltz to be ambassador to the United Nations during his confirmation hearing.
Now, Mr. President, Americans woke up this morning to a troubling headline. U.S. inflation accelerated in June as Trump's tariffs pushed up prices. That's what the New York Times said this morning. We've said from the start that Donald Trump's tariffs are a national sales tax on working and middle-class families. And now, these tariffs are causing inflation to rise, as many of us feared. And there is too large a chance that this tariff increase is just the beginning as increased chaos on tariffs rise. Tariffs raise the price of groceries, add thousands of dollars in additional costs to the average household, and Trump's chaotic approach does nothing to make our economy stronger. Even worse, real wages are down for June as Americans pay more for groceries, electricity, health care costs, and that is before the big ugly betrayal, which will steal people's Medicaid, kill jobs, and jack up people's electricity bills. Remember what Donald Trump said on the campaign trail? He said that if elected, he would bring costs down on day one. It is now the middle of July, inflation is going up, and that is the definition of a broken promise. Now on cuts. Fresh off handling billionaires their largest tax break in modern history, and fresh off passing the most devastating cuts to health care and good-paying jobs ever, Republicans want to do it again. While Republicans roll out the red carpet for billionaires and special interests, they want to cut funding to local news and cut funding for critical foreign aid that keeps China and Russia at bay. Americans rely on public broadcasting for weather alerts, and these cuts couldn't come at a worse time. The disaster in Texas reminds us that accurate and speedy forecasts are vital to protecting our country and the lives of Americans. And public broadcast is vital and public broadcast is a vital and often the only way to get the word out, particularly in rural America. So why the hell is the administration so obsessed with cutting these life-saving services when they are critical for keeping people safe, when we didn't have those services working full steam ahead, how many people's lives are endangered and lost in Texas and around the country? Public broadcasting does more. It is crucial for Americans to receive the local news, for keeping track of City Hall, for understanding what's happening in their local school boards, for updates on public events, festivals, for educational programming, when we know that traditional television is having a lot of trouble. And to be clear, it's not just local news and public radio stations at risk. This package endangers national security, our own national security. American aid is vital for preventing pandemics and diseases throughout the world. Foreign aid helps farmers. It helps American researchers. It helps U.S. businesses. And more importantly, American aid is vital to holding the line against the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin. If Republicans eviscerate foreign aid, our adversaries will celebrate America's retreat and move to fill the vacuum. The worst part is that these recession cuts are the beginning only. This package, as bad as it is a piece of a larger puzzle for Republicans. Their goal is to use rescissions, impoundment, and pocket rescissions to eradicate any bit of bipartisanship out of appropriations, and will pave the way for deeper and even more serious spending cuts on things like health care, food assistance, energy, and so many other areas. In fact, many in the Freedom Caucus claim that Donald Trump and Republican leaders promised these deeper cuts by these means in exchange for their vote on the big ugly bill. We know that Donald Trump and Russell Vought want to send another rescissions package later this summer. Are they going to make more cuts to Medicaid? Are they going to make more cuts to education or nutrition services or aid for veterans? Republicans didn't bat an eye when adding $4 trillion to the debt to lower billionaires' taxes, but suddenly, when it comes to local news and rural radio stations, they suddenly balk. They say it's waste. That's disgusting. On FEMA. Search and rescue efforts continue in Central Texas 11 days after the devastating July 4th flooding. We continue to pray for every life lost. We pray for the families, and we honor the brave first responders who have been on the ground day after day after day. But honoring those we lost demands accountability. It demands making sure this never happens again. The more we learn about what went wrong, the more one thing becomes painfully clear. Donald Trump, Secretary Noem, and the Department of Homeland Security have failed in their basic duty to protect Americans from natural disasters. After spending months demonizing FEMA, after openly calling for it to be dismantled, after shedding thousands of staff and canceling billions in funding, Trump and Noem's disastrous policies have come back to haunt Americans battered by disasters. This latest tragedy happened in Texas, but the problems go far beyond Texas. This is a nationwide FEMA failure, a systemic issue across the agency that Donald Trump has made much, much worse. So today, I'm calling on the Comptroller General of the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, to immediately investigate, one, how FEMA's funding cuts, staffing cuts, and policy changes contributed to the failures in Texas, and two, to assess the risks their actions pose for future disaster response nationwide. The facts are alarming. FEMA contracts stalled while survivors called for help. Vital staff positions sat vacant. Rescue and recovery efforts were bogged down by bureaucratic choke points. These aren't just breakdowns. They may constitute a dereliction of duty by those entrusted to protect the public in times of crisis. The American people have a right to know, did these reckless decisions cost lives? Are we now more vulnerable when the next storm, fire, or flood strikes, wherever it strikes? A comprehensive and urgent review is not just warranted, it is essential. Americans do not support the administration making radical DOGE cuts to agencies like FEMA. These cuts have devastating consequences in life and death situations like a natural disaster. Americans do not support chaos from the government when disasters strike. They do not support red tape that leaves families stranded and communities battered. Now on DOD and Grok AI. Just days after Elon Musk's AI model Grok glorified Hitler, pushed Nazi propaganda, and spouted anti-Semitism, Elon Musk's company was handed a $200 million DOD contract to deploy Grok in our national defense systems. Soon, the same AI model that called itself Mecha Hitler and recommended a second Holocaust will be used in the Pentagon to address critical national security challenges, quote unquote. This Musk contract is not just wrong, it is not just offensive, it's dangerous. The Trump administration must explain how this happened, the parameters of the deal, and why they think our national security isn't worth meeting a higher standard. On Mike Waltz. This morning, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is hearing testimony from Donald Trump's nominee for U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz. If that name sounds familiar, it's because the same Mike Waltz was fired as the National Security Advisor a few months ago after sharing military plans in a group chat with a journalist on Signal. Mr. Waltz was part of the crack team that has grossly mismanaged national security during the opening months of the administration, from Signalgate to Ukraine weapons and intelligence pauses to outsourcing Air Force One to a foreign country. He must directly answer for these debacles in front of the American people before assuming a critical role on the world stage. With so much going on around the world, and with Mr. Waltz, with so much going on the world, with so much going on around the world, Mr. Waltz must acknowledge these failings and prove he's ready to collaborate with our partners and go toe-to-toe with our adversaries at the UN.
Thanks for listening. This program is copyrighted by Federal Network, Incorporated, and provided only for informational and educational purposes. Unauthorized reproduction, distribution, or use of this episode without expressed written permission from FedNet is prohibited.